The effects of the Korean War on Japan revival after WW2. WW2 was finished on August 14, 1945 when Japan surrendered. But this point isn't completely true. On this day conflicts ended, however. An official peace treaty was signed between Allies and Japan just 6 years later on September 8, 1951. Why the peace treaty was signed too late? The truth is, after Japan was defeated, the US didn't trust Japan and decided to weaken this country and put Japan under pressure to stop the people and politicians. The point that everyone knows is Japan was disqualified from having an army according to the constitution that Americans wrote for Japan. But this point is hidden from the public that Americans demolished almost all of the traditional structures in Japan. Before WW2, some economic trusts named Zaibatsu were the real governors of Japan. The US dissolved Zaibatsu after WW2 to repress Japanese traditional noblesse and to prevent people from communism. Foundries and shipyards shut and the output of the power plants was reduced critically. Laborers were protected by law and they could join the syndicates. Syndicalism was a crime before WW2. Reforms expanded to agronomy after industrial reformisms. Landholders lost their farms and the large farms were divided between farmers. Then, middle-class people expanded. Some reforms were made in education to protect children against the Japanese knighthood spirit, bushido in Japanese term. American education replaced the Japanese system and schools became co-education. On the other hand, in the 1930s communism was spread in Japan and there was the fear of more spreading of communism after WW2 because of the bad economic situation. Chiang Kai-shek's defeat by Mao's communists alarmed the US politicians. In 1948, Secretary Dean Acheson tried to recover the industries and economy of Japan to prevent joining this country to the communist bloc. Surprisingly, Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea in June 1950 obsessed Americans more than before. The US and its allies landed their forces on the Korean peninsula to help South Korea with the UN permission, but the interference of China ruined the US plans. American efforts to communism repression in the Far East forced them to ally with their ex-enemy Japan. Far distance between the US and battleground caused their strategists to look for a suitable bridgehead in the Far East as a foothold, and that foothold was not except Japan. In that era, Japan was sunk in inflation and descent with a broken economy. So, in the first step, Americans decided to recover Japan's economy until Japan could stand on its feet. The first negotiations between the US and Japan began in 1950 through John Foster Dulles Initiative, and on the next September, Japan and 47 allies signed the Treaty of San Francisco. On the same day, Secretary Dean Acheson and Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, Japan's Prime Minister, signed U.S. Japanese Security Treaty. This pact allowed Americans to hold their troops in Japan and guaranteed to defend Japan. Next year, allies left Japan officially, and Japan joined the UN. The Security Pact gave Japan a chance to come back to the industrial countries club. Japan became not only the US ally but also its storage and logistics center in the Far East. The Japanese economic trusts were revived under the new name Keiretsu to start the Japanese recovery. The US Army contracted Japanese industries to supply their troops in Korea. After the beginning of the Korean War in June and July 1950, the trade balance became positive for the first time after WW2. In 1951, Japan's reserves in the American banks exceeded $400 million. Korean War affected shipyards and shipping companies directly. Japanese ships brought troops and goods to Korea. Japan had 1,546 tons of shipments that could be used for the American campaign. Japanese shipyards revived after the beginning of the Korean War, and the first Japanese ship built after WW2 berth in New York in February 1951. In March, Japan had 108 ocean liners, 630,000 tons, and 241 other types of ships, 154,800 tons. In this year, negotiations began for their fishing rights. In 1951, Japanese fishers gained 4 million tons. Korean War requirements caused Japanese shipyards to recover as soon as possible, and Japan became the first country in this field some years later. Until 1954, Japanese defense industries sold $3 billion in goods to the U.S., and 27% of their export belonged to the U.S. 2 years after the beginning of the war, indices of all industry activity, 1934-36 equals 100, exceeded 144% and grew 5% relative to 1 year ago. Foreign soldiers' peregrination, for rest and medication, in Japan was a foreign exchange source. In 1951, it estimated that American troops spent $297 million in Japan. By the way, we can say that the Korean War was a Marshall Plan for the Japanese. The U.S. agreement to join Japan in the Gulf had the best effect on Japan's economic situation. The Far East, mainly China, was the first market for Japan before WW2. China's joining the communist bloc caused Japan to lose its chance as the first foreign partner, and Japan was forced to find another market. So, the Japanese melted into the global economy. Korean War ended while Japan became the first economic power in the Far East and started its economic miracle.